Welcome, everybody, to the Upstate Interview Series. I'm Luke Perry, and today my guest is Brett Orzechowski, Associate Professor of Management and Business Analytics at Utica College, the author also of Foil, the Law and the Future of Public Information in New York by Syracuse University Press. Brett is also an inspiration and mentor to this center from the beginning. Thank you, and welcome, Brett.
Luke, thanks for having me. Absolutely my pleasure helping out a colleague and doing some really fantastic work, not only with what you're doing with New York 22, but really the public affairs center and really how much work you've put into it. I know it's a great asset not only for the college but the region as well, filling the void and really adding your expertise. So enough with the plaudits. I know you want to get into the Q&A here. But again, I know you've worked hard on this, and it's really great that this has evolved, and I'm honored to be on your show. So thank you.
Thanks so much, and maybe one day the election will end. In the meantime, I'm looking forward to speaking with you as a business practitioner, an entrepreneur, as a business scholar. This is a particularly timely subject. As you know, COVID has been disruptive to social and economic norms. So let's start with this. What are the major challenges facing new businesses in New York?
When we're talking mostly about New York, it's a microcosm of what's going on across the country, right? We also have the fact that New York is very bifurcated with the downstate and upstate economies as a whole. And where we're really seeing the pandemic impact business upstate is really in the small towns, communities, and smaller cities as well. Cities, the fact that the walking traffic, the day in, day out, the smaller businesses that rely on not only government centers but business hubs in downtowns, that's going to impact everyone down there. I see that some cities, even Utica, has taken the step to make sure that those small businesses are still buoyant, not only solid but buoyant in some capacity. But in terms of small business startups in upstate New York and really downstate as well, meaning New York City and the metropolitan tri-state area, is that we're seeing two very different movements right now. Because markets still remain fairly strong, this has helped tech-related businesses. You still don't have the traffic in and out of metropolitan areas. The nature of work, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit, has changed as well, where people are working remotely. So tech-related businesses, fintech, et cetera, really haven't been impacted as much simply because a lot of their success is predicated on markets. Where other companies and where other small businesses have been hurting, especially like I mentioned in the foot traffic, restaurants, et cetera, retail, that's all shifted. Retail sector has changed quite a bit, simply because they now embrace carriers like Amazon, and other folks relying on their goods, especially when we're talking about products, not so much services. But the startup communities, something that I've devoted a lot of time to over the last 5-6 years, it's kind of remained stagnant. There's been some pockets of success. We're talking about Buffalo being New York's second largest city. Still has thrived a little bit in the tech sector, but the growth that we were seeing, before the pandemic hit a year ago, this time where we started seeing it, stagnation is probably the best way to describe it. I look at my students both on the undergrad and MBA levels where their ideas are, let's wait and see. I have this great idea. What are the challenges? How has COVID changed not only my business plan, but my business structure? But what is that even going to look like 6 months from now, a year from now? So we're really in this holding pattern outside of tech sector. Where that's maybe helped is in healthcare management, healthcare related startups, where they realize that it's not so much that they're embracing the change, they realize that there's a need for it, especially with like telemedicine, telemedicine startups as well, where those rural areas are people that just realize that they're homebound, especially in the sunny yet snowy upstate winters. There's a need for that. Healthcare isn't going to stop. It's now really more top of mind. So again, stagnation is what we see, especially on the startup side, because it's a wait and see. And a lot of the funding, not only on the investment side, private equity as well as venture capital, has really been a wait and see. What can we do? On the government side, they're just looking to help. How can we make sure that more small businesses don't close? And the data on that is not only scary, but it's something that I think government's done a pretty good job of, especially here in New York, of responding to it. And if you want to get into the PPE loans, PPP, excuse me, PPE, not the PPP, we could talk about that as well. But I'll stop right there. So that's my outlook on what we're seeing upstate.
Thank you. Before we get into government policy, can you help us parse the duration of these changes in regards to the impact? I mean, how do entrepreneurs make sense of what has been a short-term change, whether we're talking about remote work or the growth perhaps of the tech industry, as opposed to a long-term change? What's the mindset out there now, and how do you advise people to make sense of these disruptions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're past the point now, almost a year into the pandemic, of saying, all right, what does 3 months look like? What does 6 months look like? How can I forecast for 9 months? Especially for those companies that rely on seasonality. You talk about points north in the Adirondacks that have relied on tourism. Upstate New York has always relied on tourism to a point. How did that look like for the spring and summer, especially with departments of health and really the confusion that lied there? Those companies and those businesses took a hit. So we're past the point now of saying, all right, how would we assess the damage, so to speak, and how can we prepare, for the spring and summer months where the vaccine is here? There's still going to be some social distancing measures. There's still going to be some government intervention where for seasonality businesses, I think they'll be more at ease, or maybe even being more creative with how they can generate more revenue, knowing that there's going to be a little bit of an opening up. To what degree, I don't know. For those startups or those companies that have relied not only on investment, we'll take this, when you ask me to parse this, we'll take it in two different directions here. For those startup companies that have relied on investment, a lot of that investment has dried up to a point simply because, those quarterly cycles now are monthly cycles. How do we keep people on payroll? We need that infusion of capital and investment. Investors may be looking somewhere else. And that's, upstate, we're saying, hey, the investments we made, how can we make sure that they don't go under, that they're still intact? And don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of success stories, but we haven't just seen the growth. Now we're seeing more of a little bit consistency. We're in February now, middle of first quarter, where now I think companies are more looking toward quarter 2 and quarter 3 to say, look, people are going to be slowly returning to the physical space. There's going to be a little more investment. People are going to be a little more inclined to take on risk. How can we get back to the point where we were maybe 15 months ago? And I think that's where a lot of people maybe are taking a step back to say, okay, what did the climate look like at the end of 19, beginning of 20? We had to start over. The last point where you're asking me to parse it is those businesses that rely on foot traffic, smaller cities, smaller communities, seasonal, the small towns that rely on that as well. Not only are they getting a little bit of shot in the arm with government intervention, or if they budgeted correctly, dipping into reserves, but I think they're slowly going to see the economy come back, not as quickly as they want to. We're looking at 2022, to be honest with you, to get back economically to where we should be.
And when things do open up, building on what you said before about a bifurcated economy, how can we compete here in upstate in comparison to downstate when it comes to attracting new businesses?
Yeah, and this is where I think it's interesting, where there could be a micro strategy for a lot of municipalities in a lot of ways, where there's been somewhat of a forced migration, so to speak, from really larger tech hubs. U-Haul, of all outlets, now are like opening up their data to show migration patterns based off rentals. People just leaving areas because they realized that metropolitan areas, when the pandemic started, were really hotbeds for COVID spread. And those are where tech sectors are: Boston, New York, San Francisco, Austin. Those are, Seattle. Those are really the 5 largest investment tech hubs, where we're seeing this dispersion of talent in some way, where people are now working remotely. Are they going? People going to go back to cities? I think you have a better handle on that than I do, and with obviously your expertise and your policy background, where I think people are always going to migrate toward urban centers. And I think we have a healthy history of that in the U.S. Is it going to be as quick as in the past? I'm not really sure because of technology. People now can work remotely. And are we going to see the tourism bounce back in New York City? Absolutely. Are we going to see more companies thrive as they did? I'm not really sure. And I think this is where an opportunity lies for upstate cities and small areas, simply because if you're going to promote your community, and especially people with young families, tech workers who are traditionally younger are now maybe thinking, want to start a family? Which communities am I going to move to? What's the quality of life? I can work anywhere I want. Is that enough for tech startups or just any small business to say, we're going to pick up stakes and move to something that's a little more fiscally affordable, like upstate New York? That could be a real potential and real opportunity for upstate New York in a lot of ways. It's always been a sales point, a selling point of saying, hey, it's cheaper upstate. And I think that's where government officials may need to rethink how they're framing it, because, like I talk to, my students and other folks, if you say that your product is cheap or your area is cheap, I think that carries a negative connotation, as opposed to, hey, guess what? Your dollar goes further. Economically, it's been proven it's a more cost-effective solution to move upstate. But we're also seeing the number of businesses that rely on 200, 300, 5,000 people. Those don't exist as much as they used to, where smaller startups or smaller businesses rely on 6 people, 7 people, a dozen people. And for downtown hubs that want to bring that life back, maybe focus on making it a little more appealing for really those 6 to 7 to 10 people companies, which is really the small business, and say, what can we do to help them get off the ground? And that's a real opportunity. If we're trying to look at the positives of this, I think more and more people are looking at, say, hey, how can this really benefit us to get our communities going again? And that could be a strong strategy, not so much to just dilute the talent from New York City, but say, hey, people are always going to migrate to cities. What can we do to lure them away, make it appealing, but also not only build up private business, but communities as well, because usually one follows the other.
Let's pick up on that theme a little bit. Here upstate, you hear a lot about New York State efforts on economic development, but what about local governments, as you referenced? You talked a little bit about how upstate local policymakers can think about this issue. Let's talk specifically about Oneida County's effort and Reconnect Oneida County, for instance. How does this initiative, which Executive Picenti launched last fall, compare to other Rust Belt cities or the Northeast at large?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we're seeing, policy is really tough to craft. In the general public, we've always, but myself running a public policy news organization for years in Connecticut and DC, it's really interesting how people attack policy, where they realize that it's pretty complicated in a lot of ways. You're never going to make everybody happy. And this is where I think a lot of upstate communities have really tried the silver bullet theory. We talked about trickle down economics, subscribing to larger economical constructs. And those have been around for 40, 50 years now. You're talking about the 70s and 80s, saying, hey, if we lure that one company here, everything else is gonna take shape. That's really tough to do because of the tax incentives or lack thereof in New York State. On the other side of that, a lot of folks say, and I'll bring this back around to what other Rust Belt cities in the Northeast have done, and really Oneida County as a whole, because I think there's an opportunity here, is the whole concept of corporate welfare. It's a really dicey situation. We have a really good example of it in Buffalo with Solar City and Tesla, where it's $1 billion investment in Buffalo. And this is always attached to how many jobs are you going to create. What originally was promised isn't going to happen in Buffalo anymore, and this is where I think a lot of governments, especially on the state level, need to really dial back promises and say, look, in order for a large company like Tesla or Solar City to get this really sweet tax cut, you're going to promise to bring in X amount of jobs. Well, those larger companies are really tough to lure because a lot of those larger companies aren't just popping up on every corner, right? So what can you do to now change this? And I think a lot of companies and a lot of municipalities are being wise to it, where they're incentivizing migration and realizing that because of COVID, because of the nature of work, because we're in 2021 already, and there's really this rethinking of maybe even American society and culture, that there's this desire to move back to simple, to smaller towns, to really take pride in their communities, knowing that they can work from everywhere. And this is where there's opportunity. It's a great asset that Oneida County, after a lot of years, a lot of starts and stops, are able to leverage some state initiatives as well to lure CRE, to the region. That's one step. What are the next steps? And this isn't going to happen overnight. So what I think a lot of other places have done, and we're seeing examples, for instance, Vermont. I love Vermont. You should love Vermont as well. There's a lot to love about Vermont, where they're incentivizing migration to say, hey, look, we have pretty strong, if not aggressive, and this transcends party lines. As a Republican governor in Vermont, you obviously have the representation on the federal level. You go into smaller towns and they're like, well, there's a lot of parochial thought, a lot of regionalism, and that persists upstate New York. People are proud of where they're from. They realize that their 3,000 person small town has a lot to offer. But how can we lure people here? So Vermont has been really strategic and smart about their public policy and promoting it to say, by X year, we're going to be 100% renewable energy. I think Burlington may be already there, fact check me on that. But by 2030, I want to move to an area that's getting off the grid, so to speak. For a young family, that's incentive. The cost of living is a little higher, but there's also that incentive of we have a very robust public education center, public education and private education economy, similar to what we see upstate New York. You talk about small towns, we see that here, especially where we are regionally. They promote that. They've also incentivized people to move there, $10,000, no questions asked. We want you to move here. Here's $10,000. Now, if you're talking about picking up spikes and moving there for $10,000, Burlington's a pretty sweet city. Smaller towns within a 15, 20-minute drive are there as well around urban centers. It works. Tulsa, Oklahoma did the same thing. All of a sudden, within this last year or so, you're starting to see smaller cities and smaller towns or regions embrace this idea of, we'll pay you to move here. It's not so much that we don't like the people that live here. We're seeing that you offer value in this. And because you're coming with a skill, they incentivize it even more. So for instance, if you're starting a new business, we're going to incentivize it and give you more money. If you bring in a tech skill, a medical skill, an educational skill. Countries do this. Canada does this with visas. Australia does it as well. Oh, it's a higher ed, higher, really skills that are in demand that really align with 2021 sector growth. We're going to give you a little more incentive to move here. That looks pretty appealing, to a lot of folks. So when you talk about Rust Belt and upstate New York, I think people are starting to realize now that just the incentive of saying, hey, our housing stock is plentiful, you can buy houses cheap, really isn't enough to get you where you need to be.
And last question, Brett. With the budget crunch that our state and many other states now face because of decreased tax revenues, because of the economic problems we're talking about, very quickly, do you think that's going to make it more difficult to do some of the things that you described, or is that necessary to get where we need to go?
When you talk about budget crunch, it's very real. You talk about cities, for all, Albany, for instance. I know Utica is the same way, where somewhere, I think somewhere between like 60 and 70,000, 60 and 70% of all property, for instance, in the city. And we see this a lot in the Northeast, especially, those cities that are entrenched and been around for decades or centuries, where the tax revenue just isn't coming in because a lot of the area has nonprofits, where some, Connecticut has it, New York has it, the payment in lieu of taxes, pilot programs, where I think that helps. You're looking at a lot of nonprofits, hospitals, higher ed areas that, the taxes just aren't there, but the payment in lieu of taxes program, I saw it in New Haven with Yale, for instance, it works simply because you're being a good neighbor within the region to say, hey, we're going to help a little bit with the taxes as well. What can we do to help? Is that going to shore up a deficit? No. But I really think there has to be a happy medium that's struck between government incentives. And we see this in Oneida County too, with luring government jobs or government businesses. Those don't bring in tax revenue. Private business does. And that's why it's really difficult to shape public policy, especially in upstate New York, is because what's that happy medium look like? Do you want to rely on government intervention, or do you want to make it an incentive enough to lure private companies to also shore up that tax base? And until local government really strikes that happy medium, it's going to be tough to really lure private companies here.
Thanks so much, Brett. Really appreciate your time and input. And thank you, everybody, for watching. For more, you could go to ucpublicaffairs.com.